So now we know what a promise is. Let's look at how we would use a promise. How do we write code that will monitor a promise and then allow us to do something once that promise is fulfilled or rejected? In the past, we have used callbacks for asynchronous code. When the asynchronous code was finished, it would invoke the callback. Well, with promises, we do something similar, but we use a then method to respond to a promise. Now, keep in mind, we are currently learning how to respond to promises, not how to create them. We'll look at that later on. Okay, let's look at how we would deal with this. So here is the function we've been working with, this asynchronous function that I've set up, that basically what it does is it returns a promise. It creates a promise and returns it. And so it allows us to see how we would work with promises. Now, in previous topic, I did this kind of thing. I set up a variable, and then I set it equal to that async function that I invoked. And so this variable then contained the promise. And if you remember, we looked at that on the console, and we could see when that was fulfilled. We could also see the value as a part of that promise object. That was all there. Now, by using the then method, we can set up a way to tell us when the promise object is resolved or rejected. Think of it like an event. The then method will fire when it is resolved. So we could do something like this. Promise.then, and it's a method. So we do that. We have the then method set up. Now we can do something when it is resolved, but we have to tell it what to do. Right now, we're not telling it to do anything. We have the then method, but we're not telling it to do anything. The way we tell the then method what it should do is with a function. So we pass a function into the then method. In fact, we can pass two functions. One function, the first function we pass in, will be invoked if it is fulfilled. And then the second function we pass in will be invoked if it is rejected or if it fails. So you may be thinking to yourself, haven't we just provided callbacks? And the answer is yes. So we don't eliminate callbacks completely when we use promises. It's just a much cleaner pattern. And we use the then method to manage those. Okay, let's see how we would do this. So I'm going to enter a function here, and that function is going to have a parameter. The parameter is going to be the value of the promise. Okay, it's going to store that value. And so I'm putting VAL as the variable that will store that. I'm just going to do an arrow function. And what do I want to do with this? Well, right now I'm just going to log it to the console. And I'm going to log a message like this. And what am I going to do? I'm going to concatenate on the end of it the value that we received from the promise. And so this is the first function passed in. So this will respond when the promise is resolved. And right now, that's all I'm doing up here in this function I've created. I'm calling the resolve function that's passed in. Notice the promise will receive two functions. Now you can start to see how promises are created. We're not going to go into that in detail, but you can start to see that. And so the then method here, we use one function to respond to it if it's resolved, fulfilled, and then a second function if it's rejected. Let's first look at this, and then we'll add a reject function. So save that. See, I'm going to just reduce this so we can jump out here. And it is already resolved by the time we get out here. Let me just refresh the page. We wait. 4 seconds later, it responds to it. So we're able to respond to when that promise is fulfilled. We're able to grab the value right there. And notice we concatenated it to something else as well. And so there we are responding to a promise. We've used the then method to handle that for us. Now, I said we could add two functions. One for if it's resolved and one if it fails, if it's rejected. So let's go ahead and add a second one. I'm going to put a comma after that first function. I'm going to press return just to make it cleaner. And then for the second function, let's go ahead and once again, we can have a parameter there that will retrieve the value or store the value that is received when it fails or when it is rejected. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to log to the console. I will have a message. Let's go rejected. And I'm going to concatenate the value to it as well. Similar to what we did when it was fulfilled. Now, as this function is set up, it's going to resolve, it's going to fulfill every time. It's never going to be rejected. Well, we can just modify this just a bit. Say I jump down here, and before the set timeout is complete, we go ahead and reject. And the way I reject is by invoking the function for reject. And I'm going to pass in a value. Let's pass in sorry. Okay, that's going to be the value that we pass in. Now, so far, the values I've been using are strings. Obviously, that value could be anything that JavaScript supports. But right now, I'm using strings just to make it simple. Okay, so now this function is going to reject. Let's go ahead and see if we get the rejected message. So if I save that, if you look out here, we get that rejected message pretty quickly. As soon as that is invoked, it rejects. If I refresh, you can see it again. It jumps up right away. We have the text, the string that I put in, and then we also have the value. Both of those are showing up. So this is how we need to think about promises. We call some function. It might be to connect to a server, to retrieve data from a website, to process some data, something like that. Some asynchronous process. That process is set up to return a promise. We can then use that promise to wait for the code to finish. We monitor the promise, and when it finishes, it returns its results, its value. Because it is asynchronous, other code will continue to execute. We don't hold up other code. For example, let me just add down here just a console log statement. Let's just say this code is asynchronous. So now this will go ahead and execute. It won't wait for this to end here. If I go ahead and save this, we come out here, notice that's the first line we get. That is not held up. It's not blocked by the code above it. Okay, now I want to clean this up. I've structured this in a way to help teach how promises work. And we're declaring a variable that stores the promise. But we don't need that. Promises are structured so that we can chain them together. We don't have to declare a variable. That's not necessary. So I want to take a look at that. I want to make a change to that to show you how you would normally see a promise set up with a then method. Also, I want to make our async function a bit more legit, not just a line that rejects. So why don't we go ahead and change that first? And what I'm going to do is inside of creating this promise, I'm just going to do an if statement here. And I'm going to check something. If number.isInteger, that's what I'm going to check. And I want to check a number that's passed in. So up here in this function, I'm going to now put a parameter. So what we're going to do is we're going to be able to pass in a number, and that's going to be how long it waits, how long the set timeout goes. So if it is an integer, then we go ahead and do the set timeout. But we do it with the number that's passed in. If it's not an integer, then that's where we reject it. And I'm going to modify this a bit. I'm going to say reject and num, what is passed in, is not valid, something like that. Okay? So this makes a little more sense of how this asynchronous function may be working that returns a promise. When it would resolve the promise, if it's a legitimate number, it would then do a set timeout. And so basically it's going to wait that amount of time. If it's not a valid number, then it will simply reject it at that point. Okay? Now we're going to modify down here. I don't need to set up this promise in a variable. We can just chain things. So I'm going to remove this part of it. I'm just going to invoke that async function. And then I can attach the then method immediately to that because this returns a promise. This async function returns a promise. And we can use the then method directly on that promise. Just as we've done here, this variable contained a promise. I used the then method. Well, we don't have to set up the variable. We can do it immediately because that is what is returned. So I'm going to get rid of this. I'm just going to the variable there. And here we have our then method chained immediately to the function call. All right, so now let's go ahead and pass in a valid number and see what happens. The 4,000. If I save that, we come out. We see the line, the code is asynchronous. 4 seconds later, yes, and we have the promise value. Now let's see what happens if we pass in string, something that's not valid. We see that line and we see rejected. String is not valid. And so we now have a legitimate function here, asynchronous function that's returning a promise. And we're calling it, then using the .then method to respond to it when it's either resolved or rejected. So there we've had our first introduction to using .then method. All right, let's move on to the next topic where we'll look at another example.